Excites me more about this game than anything is the fact that Texas and Georgia are both such Jackal and Hyde teams that I think this game's going to have an unpredictability aspect to it. However, when I've sat down and I've thought about this game, the more I'm convinced that Georgia is going to beat Texas for the SEC title. And no, it's not because Georgia is my preseason pick to win the national title. It's the fact that I think for a couple of reasons. One, Georgia needs this more than Texas does. And if you look at past presidents from SEC games, you say to yourself, man, Ole Miss shit the bed, Alabama did. So it kind of leads me to think to myself, maybe Texas kind of half asses this game in the sense of, hey, we don't necessarily have to win this game in order to make the college football playoff. And granted, I'm not saying that they're going to play this game like it doesn't matter. I just think that Georgia's going to have a chip on their shoulder that you can't necessarily take out of them, in the sense of, you think to yourself, with this Georgia team, Carson Beck has not thrown an interception in 118 passing attempts. His last interception actually was in the fourth quarter versus Ole Miss, and this is his longest streak of his career. And on top of that, you play Georgia Tech, you win in 8 overtimes. In my opinion, it's 4, because to me, there and back should be 1 overtime. It shouldn't be there. Not every single play should count as a separate overtime. I think that's low inflated. But you look at that Georgia Tech game, and granted, I would be the first one to tell you, I think Georgia Tech should have won that game if the referees had opened up their eyes a little bit. But at the same time, we can only worry about what's here and now. And the fact that with Georgia having that big of a scare against a really strong Georgia Tech team, who, by the way, does not get the credit they deserve at all, it's just another chip on their shoulder. It's another motivation. And Kirby Smart, when you look at some of these sort of repeat games in past history, they come out with a chip on their shoulder, and they come to win, and they play motivated. I mean, even when I sit back and I think to myself of kind of repeat matchups that Kirby Smart has had in his career, I go back to the 2017 SEC championship game versus Auburn that they won when they played in the regular season. And I also think of the 2021 national championship game versus Alabama when they beat them 33-18. So when it comes down to it, what makes Kirby Smart right now the best coach in all of college football is his ability to prepare his team for any sort of game. And like I said, I think Steve Sarkisian is a great coach. He has Texas in the right direction, and I do think eventually Texas will have their moment and win the national title. However, if Texas does have that moment, it's not going to be while they win the SEC championship. I do think that this is not going to be a cakewalk for Georgia, because when I sit down and think about this Texas team, I do think they're going to utilize Arch Manning a lot more. I'm not saying Quinn Ewers is untrustworthy, but at the same time, you have to ask yourself, in terms of this game, who's going to make more mistakes, Quinn Ewers or Carson Beck? Because if you ask me what's the one difference that's going to make or break this game, it's simple. It's going to be who makes more mistakes, and who gives up less yards after catch. To me, those are the 2 stats that you need to be looking for, because let's face it, their Texas running back Warner has been a freaking beast these past couple of weeks, especially watching the Texas A&M game. When he gets rolling, when he gets moving, he can break tackles. He's shifty. He's electric. He's quick. And when I watched him in College Station, and I watched him versus Kentucky, and throughout the course of the season, you can just see how much he's progressed and just how much of a stud he is. And it's really been great for Texas to have that weapon too, because yes, Texas, primarily speaking, even going back to the Georgia game, their bread and butter is getting those quick screen plays, getting those yards after catch, and relying on your athleticism to really get you plays. But when you have a guy like Warner who can also make a monumental impact on the game, it makes Texas that much more dangerous too. So even as I'm sitting there talking about this, yes, do I think Georgia's going to win this game still? Yeah, but at the same time, it's Texas does have does have the capability to win this game in the sense of, yes, they do have Warner. Quinn Ewers is finally fully healthy. I do think Georgia's going to have to prepare for Arch Manning. I do think they're going to have some packages for him. Maybe not necessarily sitting there throwing on 3rd and 10 with Arch Manning, but I think there's going to be a couple situations where they might try to fool Georgia a little bit and fool Glenn Schumann and see, hey, maybe we can get Archie going a little bit, or maybe we can get Warner out receiving a little bit more. So to me, it's going to be those kind of differences. But at the same time, when you look at both these teams, they've had so many ups and downs and hills and valleys that it just makes me second guess them both in general in terms of the long picture. Again, I'm not going to get into whether Texas should win this game or not. I'm not going to get into whether or not the 5th seed's better or the 1st seed's better or whatever's better, because to me, at the end of the day, the SEC championship and winning your conference championship, I'll say it over and over and over again, it freaking matters, dude. I don't care where you're seated in the playoff or what you did before. You make a statement by winning your conference championship, by beating teams on the road. And granted, they're playing Mercedes-Benz Stadium, which to me is pretty much a home game for Georgia. So when you essentially play a road game versus Georgia, you have Carson Beck, who has give him a lot of credit. You can tell towards the middle of the season that his confidence was really shaking. So for Mike Bobo and this offensive staff to really tailor this for Beck to get his confidence back, give him some of those quick reads, and to rely on the running game a little bit more. I mean, I'm not saying Nick Frazier and Trevor Etienne have necessarily taken games over. However, they're starting to get into a rhythm in the sense of they're finally starting to piece things together too. And granted, it does help that the Georgia offensive line has been a little bit better. But at the same time, when you ask yourself in terms of my worries in terms of how Georgia can possibly be, how Georgia can be defeated, one of the big things I ask myself is, what if Texas gets this running game going really, really early? And what I mean by that is, when you look back, for example, at the Georgia Tech game last week, Haynes King was sensational. Watching him be gritty, seeing the blood and the grass and just the determination that he had in order to put this Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets team on his back, be a leader, and get a couple touchdowns on the run. Because granted, Haynes King is a little bit underestimated in terms of throwing the ball, but he almost reminds me of Lenore Sellers in the sense of, when you have those 3rd and 2s, those 3rd and 3s, you can go to a guy like Haynes King. And to me, those are the situations that make you a little bit reluctant to sit here and say Georgia, because for the amount of times that Georgia has done a brilliant job at stopping the run and stopping those yards after a catch like they did versus Texas the first time, you sit there and say to yourself, just last week, they got completely ran on for the first 3 halves, for the first 3 quarters. So it's like, you sit there and say to yourself, man, Texas is a phenomenal team through and through. And I would like to give Texas a little bit of credit here too. This isn't just a Georgia fest here. I mean, let's think about Georgia. Let's think about Texas defense for a second. When I think about this defense, I say to myself, in terms of overall passing yards, the worst 2 performances they had were versus Michigan and Kentucky in terms of passing yards, both just about 210 yards approximately. So it's one of those things where I think this is going to be a low-scoring game in the sense of, I don't think you're going to see a ton of explosive plays from either side. However, I think it's going to be a game where you're going to see 1 or 2 plays that could possibly define the game, in the sense of, I'm going to see a lot of physicality, particularly in the trenches. You're going to see, to me, a lot more running than you would anticipate. I think you're going to see some creativity from Georgia. That's the one thing I would like to see from Georgia. If you're going to make a statement and prove that you are the best team in the SEC, and if you do want to go and win another SEC title, You're going to have to get a little bit more creative. You're going to make sure Carson Beck's confidence is up, get that rushing attack going, and most importantly, making sure that front seven is making plays and getting home. When you put that all together, Georgia's one of the best teams in the country. And to me, this just feels like one of those games where Georgia is once again going to kind of piece it all together and get the victory. Now, granted, Texas Longhorn fans are going to say all around the country that, hey, Georgia's maybe gotten lucky, or maybe they just kind of show up when they feel like it. But at the end of the day, when you look at this game holistically, Texas doesn't need to win the SEC championship to get to the college football playoff. I think regardless of what you want to talk about in terms of motivation, pep talks, or whatever, we've seen that when those sort of instances happen, when those sort of hypotheticals happen, teams tend to play with a little bit less of an edge. So I'm giving Georgia an advantage in that front. I'm giving them an advantage in the sense of they've already beat this Texas team. If you're Kirby Smart, you say to yourself, hey, we took care of Auburn like we did in 2017. We took care of Alabama like we did in 2021. And we're going to take care of Texas just like we're going to do in the 2024. And who's not to say that Texas and Georgia possibly meets again too? Because I think that's one of the intriguing aspects of this entire thing. Now, obviously, it would be a little bit more fascinating if Georgia were to lose, because if you listen to Joe Chesatori, you would think that Georgia and Texas were automatically qualified regardless of what happens. However, I don't think it's that plain and simple, in the sense of, okay, Georgia's third loss technically would be in the SEC championship. And I am all for not penalizing teams for being in the conference championship game. But at some point you have to say to yourself, your strength of schedule has to matter. And it also has to matter how much you win or lose by. Because let's say if Texas just completely steamrolls them and stops the pass just like they have all season, and that linebacking core really does a great job at keeping Carson Beck centered, keeping him contained, and not letting him get into a rhythm, we could be talking about Georgia possibly not getting in. Now, do I think that's a little bit of an outlier conclusion? Probably, but in terms of this committee, in terms of the college football playoff, for the most part, they've been consistent so far, but you never know what's going to come from this committee and from the SEC football. It's been so unpredictable for the past couple weeks, but right now, give me Georgia just because of what we've seen from them. And to me, this just seems like a team that's really turning the corner and can possibly make a run depending on who ends up getting in their bracket, assuming that they win the SEC title and are one of the top 4 seeds in the country.